Welcome to Polaris-Live. This is Sarwar Kashmeri welcoming our viewers from around the world to the series of programs on the United States and China in the world. This program is co-sponsored by the Foreign Policy Association in New York and brought to you live. Viewers can ask questions by using the chat button on the right-hand side of the screen. We'll try to get to as many of your questions as time allows. As a reminder, Polaris-Live.com is a commercial-free, viewer-supported channel. You can help us by subscribing to our YouTube channel and newsletter at Kashmeri.com. President Joe Biden and Xi Jinping, leaders of the two most powerful economies and militaries in the world, met this Wednesday in San Francisco for their most consequential diplomatic rendezvous in many years. Americans, indeed the world, had many questions for them, including the future of their $700 billion trading relationship. Will it survive, given that standards of living in both countries are so closely linked? Will the two superpowers' militaries ever return each other's phone calls, especially dangerous situation, seeing that both countries' navies and air forces bump up against each other in the seas around China? So how much did this meeting accomplish? With so much riding on the outcome, Polaris-Live decided to invite leading experts from China and the United States to give our viewers their thoughts about what was accomplished, what was not. Professor Dao Jiang, the well-known international scholar from Peking University, presented the China perspective earlier today. We now have Bonnie Glaser, Managing Director of the German Marshall Fund USA's Indo-Pacific program, to present the view from the United States. Let me welcome Bonnie Glaser.
Thank you, Sarwar. Thanks for having me on your show.
Bonnie, thank you for taking the time to come. I know that you've probably got half of the world's cable channels behind us, so we won't keep you for more than 2 or 3 hours. No, I'm kidding. Listen, let's start, Bonnie, with an overview of the meeting that was just held, right? The leaders of our two great countries. What do you think was accomplished in this 4-hour meeting, and what was left behind?
Well, first, let me say that I think that both countries and both leaders had an interest in achieving a stabilization of this relationship. We saw this, of course, 1 year ago in Bali when the two presidents met. And for various reasons, including the Chinese spy balloon episode, that understanding really did not hold. And this was a renewed effort by the two leaders. And in the interim, there have been some new developments that I think have, again, driven both of those leaders to want stabilization. And on the Chinese side, I do believe that the economic headwinds that China is facing, the restrictions on technology transfer that are coming from the United States and its allies were factors that were influencing the Chinese side to really feel that stabilization in this relationship was important for China. And for the United States, we are heading into a presidential election year, and we are focused on 2 other wars that are taking place in Gaza and in Ukraine. But also importantly, ever since the Biden administration came in, they have tried to achieve an understanding with China that this relationship is dominated by competition. We have to manage our differences and this competition so it doesn't escalate to conflict. And one of the things that's quite notable is that the Chinese readout of the summit says that the two sides should responsibly manage their differences. This was language that was coordinated. It was worked out with the United States. And I think it's an achievement that the Chinese side has accepted that it is important to responsibly manage our differences. That said, Xi Jinping has not accepted that the relationship is dominated by competition, and that is a difference that the two have. Now, in terms of what we could call deliverables, the two very important things from the U.S. perspective is the resumption of mil-mil dialogues, the 3 dialogues that had been suspended after former Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, visited Taiwan, have now been removed. And those engagements will be renewed. Whether they produce anything is a question mark, because there's a lot of friction in the way that our two militaries are operating at very close proximity in various places close to China's coastline. But it's very welcome that both leaders have agreed to resume high level as well as working level mill dialogue. And then there's the fentanyl agreement. And I cannot underestimate and should not the really significant impact on the United States if China follows through on this understanding. And they have already sent out notices to some of China's chemical companies. And I have heard they have shut down some of those chemical factories already that are producing these precursors. This could really have a positive impact on the US-China relationship. It's very important to President Biden as he heads into this election. Let's remember that Americans between the ages of 18 and 49, fentanyl overdose is the largest killer. So this is really important to the president.
Well, you have followed this encounter between China and the United States far longer than most people that I know. So it's really heartening to hear what you have just said, Bonnie, and your conclusions. Let me point out a couple of things on fentanyl. I'll take that first. The Chinese perception is that, America and China have coordinated opioid restrictions and so on for many years, almost since 1983, they point out. But they said the United States in 2020 sanctioned the leading lab in Beijing that works out the evidence and that tracks these horrible things coming into the country. And when we put sanctions on it, we kind of destroyed a part of this cooperative effort. Is that something that you disagree with, or have you come across that line before?
I have. It's really only part of the story. And this is a very technical issue, and I won't pretend to understand it completely. I'm not a chemist. But we really need to go back to the Trump administration, which was when the Chinese agreed to put the fentanyl on the control list of controlled substances. And the shipments of fentanyl from China to the United States really did go down. At that time, I've heard that from officials in the United States.
Right.
But we thought we'd solve the problem. But then what happened was these precursor chemicals started going from China to Mexico and then getting manufactured into fentanyl, and the drug cartels from Mexico then selling them or sending them to the United States. And so the problem morphed. It became much more complicated. And the fact that those labs, and it's more than one lab, but it's several labs that are under the Ministry of Public Security in China, had been put on an entity list. It's the Forensic Police Institute that is in charge of the labs that was put on the entity list. And I think that certainly discouraged anyone in China who wanted to help the United States from continuing to provide any assistance. It just soured the Chinese on the entire issue. And for the last year and a half, 2 years, the Chinese have been telling us, if you want our cooperation, you're going to have to take those entities off the list, the Forensic Police Institute and its labs. And the United States agreed to do that. And that was already done on the day, I believe, of the summit or shortly thereafter. And so we have an understanding with the Chinese, and now it's just a question of implementing it. And I certainly hope that our law enforcement entities can resume cooperation, not only on this, but on other things, because we actually have a history of some good cooperation between our law enforcement agencies.
Well, that's very heartening to hear, and it simply adds more ammunition to what you've said earlier, which is that things really did get accomplished. We got a bunch of things done on this. I did have a chance to listen to President Biden's press conference after the meeting on Wednesday, and I mean, I have to tell you that I was quite surprised that it was positive, and he carefully thread the needle, if you will. But on the whole, it gave a lot of us hopes that things are on the mend. And it seems that you feel that way. Not to say they're there, but they're on the mend, and certainly much better than they were a few months ago.
Well, I do not use words like reset or mutual trust, because I don't think that those are achievable goals. But I do think that having the presidents get together, be very candid and direct, and let's remember these men have met many times, they know each other for more than a decade. That's not to say that they have a lot of personal chemistry, that's not my point, but they can speak to each other very directly and express their concerns. And I understand that is what they did when they met in San Francisco. And so even on areas of differences, they had a very useful exchange of views on Taiwan, for example. And some of that has been reported. President Xi Jinping apparently said China doesn't have plans to use force against Taiwan. But of course, he warned against circumstances in which he might be compelled to do so. And that's not new. I think Xi Jinping has conveyed that in the past. The two presidents also talked about the upcoming elections in Taiwan. And I think that's very useful. We in the United States, as President Biden said, do not want Beijing interfering in these elections. We want to leave it up to the people of Taiwan to decide. And we hope that whoever is elected, that China will consider resuming some official channels with the government in Taiwan.
It sounded like it was a very well balanced scenario that was played out, because I remember the president answering one reporter's question on Taiwan, and he wouldn't be drawn into a pro and cons, and all he said was, Bonnie, if I remember correctly, that listen, we agree that there is one China, and beyond that, I don't want to go. I thought that was very well crafted. Do you?
He did not say we agree that there is one China. So I have to say,
okay.
we should go back and quote the president accurately.
Okay.
But I don't have the verbatim in front of me, but what he said was something like, we have a one China policy.
We have a one China.
That's actually different because when we say that there is one China, the US position is there is one China in the international community. But we do not accept Beijing's claim that Taiwan is part of China. We acknowledge that Beijing has made that claim, but we don't take a position on Taiwan's status. And so it is important to get this right. The president has often misspoken. He has mischaracterized US policy toward Taiwan. He has misquoted, in my view, the Taiwan Relations Act. In the past, he has even said Taiwan is independent. We should let it do what it wants. So he has misspoken at times in the past. But this time, he was very, very careful. He just said, we have a one China policy. We're going to stick to that.
Well, now I don't feel too bad if he's mispronounced. But, it was what you're saying was really underscored, Bonnie, because precision on this issue is so important. And, and he had the cards. I'm sure his staff had written down the main points that he had to follow. And he was just flawless in that whole thing. But let me move on a little bit to the military side. Right. One of the issues that China points out is that, hey, listen, this business of communications and so on, it's important. And these are my words now, but that's a second order effect. The main issue is, how would you feel if Chinese military intelligence were working on the coast of Maine in the United States? So it's not so much that, you need to open communications. And why are you guys here in this part of the world? What if we were doing this along the coast of Maine? How do you respond to that?
The United States, I think, has had a very long-standing position that we welcome China to sail and operate in international waters anywhere. And there have been times where China has sailed very close to US shores. The reason the Chinese cannot operate as frequently around the coast of the United States is they don't have bases near the US from which they can operate. We are able to conduct daily intelligence, reconnaissance, surveillance operations around China because we have access to bases in China's neighboring countries. So that is a difference between our countries. But frankly, every time China has sailed and operated close to the United States, we have not opposed them. They have also conducted what we call innocent passage, just sailing through our territorial waters. That's within the 12 nautical miles. The United States has never criticized China for doing so because that is within their right under international law. So I don't accept China's complaints of, oh, how would you like it if we were looking into your living room and observing what you were doing? And I responded to one person on Twitter who made this argument. I said, if we are looking in your windows, we are doing so from the street, which is not your property. It is shared community property, and we have every right to be driving on that street. And that's my analogy.
Well, it makes sense. Of course, China always points out this idea that the Law of the Seas Treaty of the UN, that China has endorsed it, accepted it, but the US has not ratified that. Is there a quick response to that? Why have we not ratified it? One, and two, does it make a difference?
I have long advocated that the U.S. ratify it. In testimony in Congress, I have asked Congress to ratify it. So I certainly support it. But this is a complicated issue of a group of Republicans in Congress who believe that there are elements of the treaty that are not favorable to the United States and don't want to tie our hands. My understanding is actually the concerns have in many ways already been addressed. They have to do with the seabed and gaining access to the seabed, but I don't want to go into this, of course, in any detail because it would take a long time. But essentially, my short version of this is the United States has not ratified the treaty, but we observe it. China has ratified the treaty, but it does not observe it. So which do you think is better?
So we've talked about the fentanyl issue. We've talked somewhat about the military issue. The New York Times this morning says that now I have to be very careful how I mention quotations with you around, Bonnie, but I think they said something like, this was the first time the two presidents have met when the dynamics have slightly changed, where the Chinese president really needed to get something from the American side. They were talking about the economy. That no secret that China's economy is sputtering a bit, and he he really wanted to make some inroads into easing some of the sanctions and also the export controls and just get some inward investment help and so on. Is that a true? Do you think the Times got that right, that the dynamics had shifted this time when the two presidents met?
Well, I do think that the Chinese need to have a stable relationship, but I don't think they came into this summit expecting to get the restrictions on technology, these export controls, maybe the forthcoming outbound investment restrictions. I doubt that the Chinese believe that they could get President Biden to pause or roll back these restrictions. This is an integral part of U.S. strategy to invest, align, and compete, which is what Tony Blinken uses to describe our strategy and is guiding the entire Biden administration. The U.S. About a month or so ago agreed to create a channel with our Department of Commerce and its counterpart in China on export controls that is really not aimed at negotiating, but rather at previewing for China and explaining to China our intention, what we plan to do, giving them a heads up on new measures that we might be taking. So if Xi Jinping walked into that summit thinking that he could convince Biden to roll back these measures, then he wasn't getting good information from his staff, and that would be disappointing. I would highlight that when Speaker Nancy Pelosi was going to Taiwan and Xi Jinping had met with President Biden in this virtual meeting beforehand, my understanding is Xi Jinping asked President Biden to stop her from going. And President Biden said he could not. So I don't rule out that Xi Jinping didn't get good information again in advance. But I hope that he was not disappointed, because the Biden administration, I think, has been crystal clear in talking to Chinese counterparts that we are being careful. We have narrowed the scope of these restrictions. It is a small garden, high fence strategy, as they say. And they believe that normal trade should flow freely. The percentage of products and technologies that are being affected are limited. Some of them will just be, for example, on the outbound investment, just reporting requirements. So this is the message that the Biden administration has been giving to the Chinese. So I think it's true that China's economy is sputtering a bit. But maybe the main message that Xi Jinping should have been giving was reassuring the business community.
And I was about to actually come to that. I was talking to a CEO of a big US law firm last week, and they mentioned that they had very steadily removed people from their offices in both Shanghai and Beijing. And they said that they were just keeping a skeleton crew to see how this went. They were really concerned about the raids and so on. And I've posed this to the China side, and their response is that that is an incorrect interpretation, if that's what some of the businesses are thinking, that they need to have a better handle on China's security needs and their own functions. Do you see this meeting that just took place, Bonnie, as easing the minds? Was there anything said that would ease the minds of American companies that are getting a little bit concerned about the raids and so on?
Well, I think that companies are looking for more than just rhetoric. You know, we can go back to the last third plenum that took place 5 years ago, some of the positive things that were said about the private sector and the importance of private companies in China, and other commitments that were made that were never followed through on. So even positive words are nice, but we're all looking to see when the third plenum is going to take place. It should be before the end of this year. There aren't a lot of days left, but usually the third plenum does preview what the intention is on economic policies. But even then, it's really actions that matter. I think businesses are a little nervous, and that's understandable, because all companies want greater predictability. Even if it's practices by China that they don't like, or laws that they are concerned about, if they are clear and the Chinese know exactly what they need to do to not cross those red lines, that is better than having this very large gray area that has created too much uncertainty.
I'm going to get a little bit into the trenches. The interpretation of China's naval building program, especially their aircraft carrier, is that why would they be making these aircraft carriers if they did not wish to challenge America, dominate the seas all around the world? I may not be phrasing this correctly, but that's kind of the atmosphere it's painted with their naval development. However, the other side points out that, hey, listen, you know, they know the power that the American carrier groups have. They know that they've never really had the opportunity, if that's the word to use, to to engage in a fight with large naval ships, large number of naval ships. Do you think that China is bent on projecting a navy that can take head on what the US has? Or do you think that these are in keeping with what they always say, which is, we want to dominate our seas like you dominate yours? And where do you come out on this?
Well, first, of course, we have to focus on everything China is doing to project power, not just aircraft carriers. And of course, if we just look at the numbers of ships that they are churning out, and we're talking about surface vessels and very large ships, Coast Guard ships as well, and then submarines, and it's huge. They are exceeding what I think the U.S. had projected a year ago. And so China has a massive navy. And if you look at it in the context of other capabilities that they have, one of the objectives is regional. It is what people have phrased the anti-access area denial capabilities, to impose unacceptable costs on a potentially intervening U.S. military force if they were to invade Taiwan or perhaps use force in the South China Sea. So I continue to think that China's military capabilities are first and foremost regional, and the Taiwan mission remains at the top of China's agenda. That said, it's quite clear from China's capabilities and its writings that China has global ambitions as well. And it would be a mistake to say China wants its military in X number of years to be exactly the same as what the US military is. I don't think that's true. I don't think that China really wants to be the global policeman of the world, which would be a phrase that they would use. But I do think that China wants to have global influence. It sees its military as an important vector and tool of just its diplomacy. The military diplomacy is something that the PLA engages in, and they have delegations visiting all over the world. They have a hospital ship from the PLA that goes around the world. They make port calls. But I will highlight that I do think that China has the ambition to have more bases. They only have one, it's in Djibouti. But if you look at this year's China Military Power Report, you will see that the number of countries that the Pentagon believes China is interested in having access, and it could be dual use, it doesn't necessarily have to be a dedicated military base. They added 5 countries from the list that they included last year. And I think last year there were like 14. If I'm not mistaken. Last year was the first time that they had included a list of countries where the United States believes that China is looking to have access for military installations where they can refuel and refurbish perhaps their ships, do maintenance, do R&R for sailors, things like that. And the Chinese are invested in 95 ports around the world. Now, that's commercial, and I am by no means suggesting that they're looking to have 95 bases.
Sure.
But some of these places, I think they have that ambition. So I think that this is a work in progress. It will evolve, but there's no doubt that China sees its own military as playing a role in advancing its foreign policy objectives.
Okay. Now, listen, I'd like to try and end on a positive kind of note, because I think the President Biden and President Xi have given us an opportunity to try and ramble in that area. So I would like to ask you, Bonnie, what are 2 or 3 of the actions that you will be watching for as we go from this conference and resume our diplomatic negotiations?
Well, I will start with this agreement to resume mill dialogue. One of the pieces of the dialogue, the mechanisms that was suspended in August of 2022, was what we call the Military Maritime consultative agreement. That goes back to the 1990s, and that is really the dedicated mechanism where our militaries talk about operational safety. I don't want to exaggerate what it has achieved in the past, because it has really been it has had great potential, I think, that has never been realized. But I hope that, given the really large and growing number of close calls, near misses, risky and coercive behavior that the Chinese, particularly Air Force, is engaging in, that we will see some new things come out of this of these meetings. That it won't just be each side playing each other's videos of a particular episode or screaming at each other, because I think that that neither side wants an accident. And neither side would want an accident to escalate to conflict if it were to occur. So I will be looking at what happens in the MMCA talks and some of the other military dialogues. And by the way, there are others that we haven't seen resumed. We used to have defense consultative talks at the undersecretary for policy level in the Pentagon. We haven't had those for a very long time. We used to have, we started having joint staff talks to talk about confidence building measures. I'd like to see those resume. So I'll be looking at the military relationship to see what really happens there. And I will be looking at Taiwan very, very closely, and how the Chinese react to whoever is elected president in Taiwan. And there are some rumors that right out of the gate, if Lai Ching-te is elected president, that the Chinese are going to put a lot of pressure on him. If that's true, I think it would be very unfortunate. And if we get a KMT president or a TPP president, as we now have the possibility of a combined ticket with Ko and-je and Ho-Yo-i, we should know that next week. If that produced an alternative to a DPP president, I hope that the Chinese would not put too much pressure on that person, whether it be Ho or Ke, to engage in political talks about the future of the relationship between Taiwan and mainland China, because that is premature, and that could really cause serious trouble within Taiwan's politics. So I will be watching that as well.
Well, Ms. Bonnie Glaser, we have run out of time. We could talk to you forever. So on behalf of the Foreign Policy Association and Polaris-Live, thank you so very much for your time and that timely and instructive conversation. I do hope you will come back and see us again in shorter than the last time. So thank you, Bonnie, very much.
Thanks for having me, Sarwar.
Talk soon. And now let me just remind our viewers that you're listening to Polaris-Live.com. Don't forget to look at our schedule, look at the YouTube channel, look at the agenda, and we hope to see you again soon. Until then, goodbye.